Hello, I'm Robert Allison. I teach history at Suffolk University, and today we'll be talking about the global economies of colonial America. As you'll recall, the whole colonial enterprise began with the small disunited countries of Europe trying to find trade routes to Asia to get the wealth of the Indies, as it was called, the silk and the tea of China, the spices and gems of India, as well as the woven cloth from India. And so they pursued this in a number of ways, which you already know about. And by the middle of the 17th century, that is the middle of the 1600s, we begin to see a real focus here as the European powers realized that they had found sources of real wealth, not necessarily in the East Indies, but in the West Indies, in Jamaica, Barbados, Hispaniola, the smaller islands, an area contested between the Spanish, the Dutch, the English, and the French in this era. And they begin producing sugar here in the West Indies, and sugar is going to become the great commodity of the Western world. Now, with these developments, we see a number of really striking things happening. If we were to look at, say, what is the big story between 1500 and 1800, one of the biggest would be the rise of Europe as the global power, the center of global power. And really, Europe rises because of the colonies that European countries plant in the other parts of the world. And another piece of the rise of Europe is the development of a whole theory of why colonies exist and why nations exist. As the rise of nations, the rise of colonies, the rise of Europe all happen simultaneously. And they happen simultaneously partly because of the trading system that these European countries develop in competition with each other. And we call this whole economic system, which dominates at least European consciousness between about 1500 and 1800, mercantilism. It's actually an economic theory. It doesn't necessarily mean merchants are in charge, but it is tied to merchants being integral to a global economy. And mercantilism has a number of different tenets to it or principles to it. And the first is that the interests of the nation are paramount. So if you are a Dutch merchant, you are engaged in trade, usually for the Dutch East India Company or the Dutch West India Company, and are looking out for the interests of the Dutch or of the Netherlands. English merchants, again, are operating through systems of trade or trading companies created with grants from either the British Crown or the British Parliament when the Crown is actually King Charles I loses his head in the middle of the 17th century. And so you're looking out for the interests of England, and similarly with the French or the Spanish or merchants from other European nations. So nations also are pursuing this. And remember, most of the European nation states don't have a great deal of power before this. And it's really the rise of the merchant sector that is also going to enrich the state. Another is that the governments and businesses have to work together to secure national advantages in both international trade and politics. So the state and the business sector, private sector are working together. Of course, in England, the House of Commons is dominated by the business interests. So it is the commoners, the merchants in the House of Commons who are driving much of England's expansion in this period. Now, another very important principle is that a favorable balance of trade, that is, you sell more than you buy, is crucial for national success. So nations want other nations to buy from them rather than buy from the other nations. Now, of course, many of the goods they had been seeking before came from China or from India. So they do want to buy those things, but then sell them in Europe. And this is why the West Indies become so important, because there these European states on their plantation colonies in the West Indies are producing sugar, which they can sell in other places. But a favorable balance of trade, selling more than you buy, is essential for a nation's success. And also, we measure national success in gold. Remember, Spain had gotten gold from the New World, gold in great abundance, and Portugal had found gold resources in Africa. In fact, they knew that there were gold resources in Africa before the Portuguese began rounding West Africa in the 1400s. So gold, though, becomes the measure of success. Remember, Spain has the resources of gold from Peru and from Mexico. The nations that don't find gold in their colonial enterprise, the Dutch, the French, the English, the Danes, the Swedes, are trying to get the gold from those that do have it in a variety of ways. One is by selling them stuff so that they have to buy the gold, and another is to steal the gold, as the Spanish treasure fleet every year leaves from Cuba and from Cartagena carrying gold to Europe. And the Dutch, the English will wait for it and try to capture some of these slow-moving Spanish vessels. But national success or national wealth is measured in gold, so nations want to accumulate gold. Now, another principle is that because sea routes are so important, sea routes this is where global trade happens, nations should build navies to secure sea routes and protect the sea routes. And then finally, we realize that colonies are beneficial, not detrimental to the mother country. There had been this idea that if people leave from Spain or from France to go to their colonies in other parts of the world, that hurts the mother country because they have fewer people. What we discover in the course of the centuries of colonization is that actually the colonies are essential to the mother country. And people leaving actually benefit because they're in colonies that are producing wealth for the mother country and also become places for the mother country to trade. In the middle of the 1700s, Benjamin Franklin wrote an essay on population, which said, look, since 1700, a lot of people have left England to go to the colonies, but the population of England has actually been increasing in this period. Spain very carefully controlled who could go to her New World colonies. Everyone had to leave from Seville, and it was a very tightly controlled thing. France also tightly controlled who could go. Countries with smaller populations, England and the Netherlands, can't control who goes, and they benefit from people going to these colonies and exploiting the wealth there. So these essentially are the principles of mercantilism, which, as I said, dominates the economic thinking of the Western world from about 1500. And no one sat down in 1500 and wrote a book, this is mercantilism and this is what you should do. But instead, we can see these principles emerging through practice. And it's actually in 1776 when a Scottish economist writes a book that says, these principles are actually wrong. If you want to generate real national wealth, what you don't do is try to control the economy and have this tight bond between the merchants and the government. Instead, you should allow free trade because free trade benefits everybody. Adam Smith's ideas will be quite revolutionary in 1776 when he writes Wealth of Nations. But these tenets of mercantilism persist in many ways to the present day. So these are essentially the principles of mercantilism. And then what do the countries of Europe do as a way of enacting them? Well, one thing they do is that they pass trade laws or navigation acts. And England in the Parliament in 1660 and in 1663 passes a series of navigation acts. And these acts require that any goods shipped out of a British dominion go in a British ship. Now, of course, the colonies in North America are building ships. So this doesn't mean the ships have to be built in England, but they have to be built in the British Empire, the British Empire in North America or in Europe. The goods have to go in a British ship. The colonies cannot export goods to any non-British port. So they don't want sugar from Barbados going to France or to New France or to a Portuguese or Dutch colony. They want the sugar to go to another British port, which could mean Boston, or it could mean Newport, or it could mean Philadelphia, but a British port. Now, because there is this control over where goods go and who is shipping, this means that governors in the colonies, particularly the British colonies, are going to have more control over the trade sector. So this is going to mean more control by colonial governors, which isn't always easy to do. The governors often in places like the New England colonies, which also have assemblies, have this idea of local control, and the idea of a governor enforcing navigation acts is a bit difficult. Also, it means European goods can only go through England. European goods go to the colonies only through England. This is tied in with the colonies can't export to non-British ports, and it also means England or European goods from France or from the Netherlands or from Spain can't go directly to the colonies but have to go through England. Now, these laws all require more of a state apparatus. As I said, the governors are going to have more control over trade. You're going to have more of a role for governors as well as for customs agents. Now, on the one hand, the parliament enacts these laws, but on the other, they are relatively slow at sending over the apparatus they are going to need. Yes, the governor is supposed to be enforcing these laws, but they don't send the customs apparatus, the enforcement mechanisms. So we still have a lot of trade going on that isn't licensed, it isn't part of this whole idea. So you require more state apparatus, you don't always send it. You do send customs agents and governors, but they sometimes have a tough time. Now, the laws are also going to provoke wars with the other rival European powers. So England and the Dutch, England and the French and the Dutch are all going to go to war with one another in this period. Spain establishes a coast guard, the Costa Guarda, to patrol its ports in South America and in the West Indies. England goes to war with Spain for control of Jamaica in the 1550s, and it's a war that goes on for about 20 years before England finally does wrest control of Jamaica from Spain. And New Amsterdam, which the Dutch had planted back in the 16 teens and 1620s, the English take in the early 1660s, the Dutch retake it in the 1670s, the English retake it. So we have a series of wars fought between these different European powers over trade and over who will control the trade in the Americas. Now, how important is trade to New England? Sometimes we think of the New Englanders simply being people in funny hats who prayed all of the time, but actually the New Englanders were very shrewd traders. They realized they had few natural resources here in New England. They didn't have gold. They could not produce silk. They could not produce tea. And the climate wasn't conducive to producing tobacco or sugar or other of the trade goods, the other commodities that'll be really valuable. But what New England does have are two things that are going to be extremely valuable to developing the economy. And one is codfish. The fishing banks off of New England, George's Bank, Stellwagen Bank, are among the richest fishing grounds in the world. And the codfish, which are here in abundance, the New Englanders are going to catch and salt and then take to the West Indies and their trade for sugar. The planters in the West Indies don't want to divert any resources to having their enslaved labor force producing food, so it's cheaper actually to buy codfish from New England, salted cod. And salted cod becomes actually a staple of the diet in Barbados and Jamaica. So the codfish, this is why, by the way, there is a codfish, a wooden codfish hanging in the Massachusetts State House, in the House of Representatives chamber. That codfish has been hanging in the Massachusetts State House since the 1740s. And in the 1790s, when the new State House opened, there was a solemn procession from the old State House to the new State House, and in front was someone carrying this 5-foot wooden cod in great ceremony. The cod points to the Democratic side when the Democrats control the legislature, to the Republican side when the Republicans have controlled it. And we also have on top of the State House, and this is actually a good trivia question for students, what is on top of the Massachusetts State House? Not the Golden Dome, but what's on top of the Golden Dome. And you'll get all kinds of fanciful answers, even from people standing in front of the State House. And what is up there is a pine cone. a pine cone that represents the pine forests of Maine, because those pine forests produced ships. The ships that are carrying the cod, the ships that are carrying the sugar from the West Indies, and the ships that will carry enslaved people from Africa to the West Indies. So the ships we can produce here with the lumber that's here in abundance is essential to this global economy. So here we have New England, and actually all of the American colonies are tied into this global system of trade. We don't produce sugar here, but we produce the codfish that feeds the folks who do produce the sugar, and then the sugar or the molasses can be brought to Boston and turned into rum, another valuable commodity. And in fact, Boston is one of the real centers for rum production into the 19th century. This is why actually there's a drink guide called Old Mr. Boston. There were a lot of distilleries here into the 19th century. And Newport also has a big rum trade, and Newport also is a center for the slave trade, as ships from Newport, as well as some ships from Boston, will bring enslaved Africans to the West Indies. So all of this fits together, and if we were in London, we would be thinking of this not as colonial trade, but as British trade. This is really the beginning of a British empire, an understanding of England being not just this part of an island. And it's only in 1707 that England and Scotland are united, their parliaments are united, but is part of a global system. In the same way, the Dutch, a very small country in Europe, have a trading enterprise that extends into the Pacific and into the East Indies and into Curacao and Antigua and Aruba, and for a time, New Amsterdam, which by the 1660s is New York. So this is the global system of trade that's emerged, and the real staple commodity in all of this is sugar. Sugar is what is going to make these colonies rich, or these empires rich, I should say. And the technique for producing sugar, the technology behind it, doesn't really change much between the dawn of recorded time, when sugar is being produced in the Indus Valley, and then sugar is being produced in Mesopotamia, in the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, and then on the islands of the Mediterranean. Really in a span through the Crusades, bring a taste for sugar into Europe, and then the Spanish and the Portuguese begin planting sugar on their islands, the Portuguese in Madeira and the other islands off of the coast of Africa, and then the Spanish in the West Indies. The technique is pretty much the same. It does require hard physical work and then tending of the plants to produce these cones of sugar or loaves of sugar, which would have looked like this. You put this dripping sugar into a cone. These have been turned right side up, and the moisture drips out. You can use the moisture for other products, and then you get these loaves of hard sugar. This is why there's a mountain in Brazil, Sugarloaf Mountain, because in the 17th century, 18th century, everyone would have had a concept of what a loaf of sugar was. I think it's something probably lost on us. So sugar is what's driving this economy, and then sugar is also going to drive competition among these powers for land to grow it. As I said, the English and the Spanish go to war over Jamaica for about 20 years, fighting a war for control of this island. And Spain finds it difficult to hold on to her island possessions. In fact, there are a lot of islands in the West Indies, and this is an opening. European powers who can't compete with Spain in getting footholds on the Spanish main, that is the mainland of Central America, South America, Mexico, do find these islands useful bases from which they can attack Spanish shipping. And this is what's happening here. We have navies being built by these nations to fight with one another, but to protect their own commerce, their own trade. And we have, this is actually Peter Stuyvesant surrendering New Amsterdam to the English in 1663. And then we also have these islands becoming bases for attacks, not by the nations themselves, but by pirates. This period between 1670 and 1720, when we see mercantilism coming to flourish as a dominant economic narrative, is also considered the golden age of piracy. If you want to consider something that involves, attacking ships and killing people, having a golden age, this would be it. And the pirates actually begin in there have been pirates throughout human history, but we see piracy developing in a certain way in this era from backwoodsmen on Hispaniola, people who lived on the fringes of Spanish society, people called bucans. And they were called bucans because they roasted things on barbecues. That is, they lived in the backwoods. They were backwoodsmen living on the frontiers of society, roasting on open fires, and they start taking canoes and attacking small merchant vessels. It's relatively easy to surprise a group of merchants if they're not expecting you to come. So they start attacking small Spanish vessels and then move up. The idea is you attack a small vessel and then you use that to attack a bigger vessel. They're based first in the fringes of Hispaniola, and then the French had taken the island of Tortuga, not a very profitable place, and this becomes a colony for pirates in the early 1660s. And both the French and the English are going to encourage these pirates, these freebooters, because primarily they're attacking Spanish shipping. And Spain, of course, is a rival to both the English and the French. Now, even after Britain or England and Spain make peace in 1660, the attacks by pirates continue. And Jamaica, which the English had won over a course of a long war from Spain, also becomes a haven for British pirates, particularly after the British begin an occupation in earnest in the 1650s. Port Royal in Jamaica is one of the most famous of these pirate ports, and Port Royal is known as a lawless place. And there's some colorful characters involved in this. For example, Henry Morgan and a group of others who had captured some ships and sailed out of Jamaica attacked 18 Spanish cities around the Caribbean, including the city of Portobello, where Peruvian silver came every year to be shipped from Portobello on the coast of South America off to Spain. And they sacked Portobello, taking the silver. And they also attacked cities in Cuba and in Mexico. Now, in 1671, Spain captured a ship, a pirate ship, a ship that had taken gold from Spain, and it seized 4,000 pounds of gold. That is 4,000 pounds in value of gold that was going from Jamaica to New York. Now, in 1690, Jamaica sent 100,000 pounds in bullion, that is gold bullion, pirates had taken from Spanish ships, 100,000 pounds in gold bullion sent to England. And that year, Jamaica's sugar crop was worth 88,000 pounds. So you have the pirates actually contributing more gold to the coffers of the British Empire than the sugar merchants. And for ordinary sailors, piracy was quite a lucrative thing. You know, maritime life was notoriously brutal in the 17th and 18th centuries. An English writer in the 17th century said that the only men who go to sea are those who cannot contrive to get themselves into prison. Wages for ordinary sailors were about £2 a month. And you have this brutal life where you're likely to drown. In fact, Dr. Johnson, who said that about the only men who go to sea, also said the only difference between going to sea and being in prison was the possibility of drowning. So you might earn £2 a month, but on a pirate voyage, you as an ordinary sailor could earn £1,000 or more. Just to give you a sense of this, £2 in the 1700 would be about 230 pounds today, whereas £1,000, well, you can do the math. How much more £1,000 would be today? It would be probably $100,000. Now, pirate ships themselves had a rather brutal democracy. There's been a lot of work done on what life for pirates was like, and some of it, well, some of what we know about pirates is romanticized, but I think even some of the historians have romanticized this brutal democracy on pirate ships because every man is equal, you all get an equal share. But then, of course, if you aren't part of this, it's a fairly brutal life. Let me just tell you one story about a group of pirates deciding how they would divide up their spoils. There were 16 men, and I think this happens in Madagascar, and they can't decide. They say, hey, dividing up all we have gotten in 16 ways, it means we all get a small share. How about if we fight for everything and then whoever wins gets it all? And these 16 men all agree to this, and they do fight to the death. And then one man, badly wounded, survives and gets it all. And then he dies shortly after this. I mean, it's a brutal world. And pirates, lest you think, boy, these pirates seem to have a lot of loot. Where did they bury it? They didn't bury it. They spent it. This is how you have so much gold going to England, or so much gold accruing into the colonies, because the pirates come to port with all of this gold they have stolen and spend it on, well, what we would call, well, what was called at one time riotous living. Now, the value of piracy, thus, to bring gold into the colonies really outweighs the downside of piracy. You think you have these guys going off robbing ships. Is that a good thing? Well, it is good if they're attacking Spanish ships or Dutch ships and you don't happen to be Spanish or Dutch, and then they come into your port and they spend all of this money. So yes, that is a good thing. Henry Morgan, the gentleman whose picture is on the screen right now, in Jamaica, as I said, he had sacked 18 Spanish cities. Spain complains about this, and they demand that England take some steps to clamp down on piracy. So England brings Henry Morgan back to England to stand trial, and he does stand trial. And it's not unclear what happened at the trial, but what we do know is after the trial, he returns to Jamaica as Sir Henry Morgan. That is, he's been knighted by the British Crown, and he's deputy governor of Jamaica. It's valuable for England to have people like Morgan attacking ships of their enemies. Now, the Spanish colonies by the 1680s have been plundered about as much as they could be. And the British government now tries to rein in piracy in the Caribbean, thinking that the benefits now are outweighed by the danger. You know, the Spanish government is upset with this, and the pirates, not having Spanish colonies to plunder, might start plundering British colonies. So the British government now does set up admiralty courts to try pirates, and even begins executing some pirates. And by this time, too, the sugar trade and the slave trade in the Caribbean are more lucrative to the British than piracy is. So maybe we should take steps to rein this in, which the English do. And another thing that happens to rein in piracy is in 1692, when Port Royal, the great pirate capital in Jamaica, is destroyed by an earthquake, which, of course, if you're against piracy, you see as the hand of God at work here to wipe out pirates. So Port Royal is destroyed. The British government now is clamping down on pirates. And what happens is that the pirates begin moving to other places, looking for where the money is. So they go to West Africa and start attacking the slave factories. A factory is a place where enslaved people are brought to the coast of Africa to be shipped off to the New World. They start attacking these. They start attacking actually slave ships themselves and capturing them. And sometimes the enslaved people are allowed to join the pirate crew. At other times, the pirates will kill them or bring them to the New World and sell them. So let's not romanticize the pirates, but look at what it is they're doing. They're bringing gold, they're bringing goods into these colonies, and they're also harassing commerce, sometimes of the enemies of the nation state and sometimes not. This is, they go to, after raiding the slave coast of Africa, they move around Africa and establish a base in Madagascar, a large island off of East Africa, which is handy actually to the Red Sea, as well as to the trading ships of India. And this actually brings one of the big issues for the English. Henry Avery, this gentleman here, that we saw on the previous slide, Henry Avery was from New York. He had a fleet of ships from Rhode Island and New York and sets up a base off of East Africa on the island of Madagascar and uses this to attack ships trading in the Indian Ocean. And in 1695, Avery's fleet attacks a fleet returning from Mecca. And this is extraordinarily valuable. These are pilgrims who had gone from India to Mecca with a large cargo of goods they had brought to show off the wealth of India in Mecca, the holy city of Islam. Henry Avery sacks them on their return to India, not realizing that the ships were on their way to and from Mecca under the auspices of Aurangzeb, the the Mughal emperor of India, one of the wealthiest men in the world. And at this moment, the English government is making a treaty with Aurangzeb, or trying to establish England's role in the trade of India. It's about this time that the British East India Company is being formed, and British merchants are going to establish a trading base in what becomes Calcutta. They establish the city of Calcutta. And they're doing this under treaty arrangements with Aurangzeb and other Rajas in India. So they want a good trading relationship with Aurangzeb so that England, and not France or Portugal or the Dutch, will control the trade of India. And then you have Henry Avery, a pirate who speaks English, attacking Aurangzeb's treasure fleet as it's returning from Mecca. By the way, each man's share in the capture of the treasure fleet among the pirates was £1,000. That would be worth 1.7 million pounds today. So it's a great thing if you're a pirate. It's really a bad thing if you're Aurangzeb, and it's even a worse thing if you're the English government, because you've been trying to make peace with this guy, and now pirates sailing out of your ports are attacking and sacking his ship, and he is furious. And now he says all the English are pirates. He wants nothing more to do with them. And what the English know, they need to get really serious now, more serious than they had to get when Spain was complaining about pirates, because there really wasn't much once the English pirates had sacked the gold of Mexico and Peru. There wasn't much else that Spain had that was of interest to them, particularly after the sugar crop is becoming more important in the West Indies. So what the English do in the wake of Aurangzeb's being furious is really take steps to try to rein in the pirates, seeing this is going to be harmful to our trade. So they send yet another merchant captain off to the Indian Ocean to hunt pirates, and that is William Kidd, who is an English merchant sailor, and he gets a commission to go off and hunt pirates. And he has close connections with the political leaders of New York. And remember, New York had been formed as a colony under the auspices of the Duke of York, who became James II. And though James II had been deposed, there's still a close relationship between the leadership of New York and the English government. In England, Francis Nicholson becomes the governor of New York, a military officer sent to control things in New York. And here William Kidd, a New York merchant, sent off to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. Well, what do you think happens? It's somewhat mysterious what happens. There is one theory that William Kidd's men said, what are we doing here hunting pirates? If we turned pirates ourselves, it would be much more lucrative. There is another theory that says, well, actually, William Kidd wanted to become a pirate all along. And they do start attacking ships, more ships sailing for the Mughal Empire in the Indian Ocean, because that's much more valuable than capturing pirate ships that might be attacking them. And William Kidd makes his way back to the New World, and ultimately is brought to England, stands trial for piracy, and then is hanged on a gibbet in the Thames River, and his body, coated in tar, hangs there for a number of years as a lesson to other pirates. So what we see happening here is the European nations developing these ideas about trade, which require a greater state apparatus. And the idea of mercantilism is to bring gold into the coffers of the mother country. And pirates do this in a bigger way than the merchants do for much of the 17th century. And they're also bringing gold resources into the colonies of British North America. And the cost of this is both the bigger state apparatus, but also the rise of piracy. Ultimately, the state apparatus is going to become strong enough to put down pirates, but it's also not strong enough to stop this idea of colonial resistance, the idea that the colonies could do very well without the intrusive hand of the mother country. Suffice it to say that in this period, that is from about 1600 to the middle of the 1700s, we see colonies developing, particularly the British colonies, which are going to dominate trade in the New World. And this trade had been set in motion by this colonial gambit. That is, England's purpose in sending out expeditions early in the 1600s was to try to find trade routes to the Indies, in the same way that Spain's enterprise had been to find trade routes to the Indies, and Portugal had been looking for trade routes to the Indies. The worlds that develop in North America are not the Indies, even though Spain maintains into the 19th century that they are, but it's all essential to creating a global system of commerce, a global system of trade, which is then going to lead to the real supremacy, political and military and economic supremacy of Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries and into the 20th century. So that's really the big story in the development of colonial America, all tied into the creation of colonial empires that are based in trade. Thank you.